I'm Noelle. I'm a sophomore studying African American Studies, Women's and Gender Studies, and Theology. I came to SLU, like many, randomly. Certainly wasn't my first choice, but I'm glad I'm here. I originally wanted to go to the University of Maryland, and I got in, and I got a fantastic scholarship. But I chose SLU for whatever reason. It was the last day to pick, and I was choosing between SLU and Maryland, and I just said SLU,
Nice.
which ended up working out for me.
Right. So you can kind of talk about, what would you say your most, salient identities are that you, claim for yourself, or that you feel like society's placed on?
In theory, that should be a simple question,
Yeah, right.
And yet it is not. So I identify as a gay, Black, Christian woman. And all of those identities are at odds with each other in the way that, I am perceived by others within those communities. And yeah, I identified, yeah. I identified as an atheist for a really long time after I came out because I thought that being gay and being a Christian were incompatible ideas. But this past semester, I stumbled upon a church in North City called St. John's, which is pastored by Starsky Wilson, who's the co-chair of the Ferguson Commission. And I was able to see that faith and justice can be in the same place and can be in a religious space. In my previous experience, I felt like I had to experience faith within the four walls of a church and justice on the outside of that. But for the first time, I'm seeing that faith and justice can exist in a Christian space, which has been really incredible. And just feeling like I don't have to silence my queerness when I step into a religious space has been really powerful, because most people don't have that experience as a queer person.
That's awesome. Do you mind talking a little bit about kind of the process of your identity development, just how that's gone, any change, you kind of mentioned a big change in being atheist to kind of coming back and finding your faith, if you've had other experiences like that helps to kind of shape your identity, and what, looking back on those, you feel like you've become more aware of, or?
Yeah, I came out when I was 16. I was a sophomore in high school, and at the time I was attending an all-white Catholic Augustinian conservative high school in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So as scary as that sounds, it was like that. And so during that time, my queerness became the focus of my identity. And I think that was by nature of the teenage years being a really self-absorbed time, and coming out is is a really self-absorbed process. And so for a really long time, I hadn't done racial identity work, and the work that I was doing, or at least I thought I was doing, was queerness work. And it wasn't until I got to college that I realized that I hadn't really done either of those things. Coming to SLU post-August 9th as a first-year student, as a Black student, I was forced to think about my racial identity in a way that I hadn't done before. And I realized last year that because I had been socialized in primarily white spaces, I hadn't thought about what it meant to be Black for me. And I felt like a pull towards Black liberation activism and engaging in Occupy SLU and engaging in the uprising in Ferguson, but didn't know how to do that because I didn't know where I fit within the Black community, because my dad's white. And I think coming to SLU, I was able to find my Blackness in a way that I hadn't before, and become comfortable with what Blackness looks like for me, which is not what Blackness looks like for everyone else. And I also realized within the context of the semester that the work that I thought I had done, the queerness work that I thought I had done, I hadn't. And I was still like feeling, what's the word? Unworthy, maybe that's the word. I found a church, I talked about this earlier, I found a church, and have now started identifying myself as a Christian, and I realized that my struggles accepting that identity have been because I don't think that being gay and being a Christian can coexist. And I said this to a friend over the weekend, that, like, internally I still feel like there's something inherently wrong with who I am. And so in that way, maybe it seems like my journey, my queerness journey has been regressive, but I think I'm like slowly finding my way to authenticity. And even if that maybe looks like I'm losing progress, I think it's real in a way that pretending the things that I feel a way that I don't isn't.
So has it been kind of like coming into these new spaces, like still like negotiating these identities and like, I don't know, I guess like feedback you got from people, or like you've talked about like a lot of self-reflection that you've done, and I don't know, just like the whole like navigation process, because I think that's something that like, well, a lot of people go through, like when you're negotiating like what you can accept for yourself and what parts like you're still struggling with.
Yeah, it's been sticky. I wrote a piece in Just Mission a couple months ago about feeling on the cusp of belonging in all aspects of my life. And not necessarily that feeling being like internal, but like feeling that externally from different groups. Because I have all of these intersecting identities that in some contexts just like aren't compatible. And so I think on SLU's campus specifically, I think I've had more like direct experience with like my Black identity and my queer identity, just feeling like I don't belong within those spaces. Rainbow Alliance, which is the queer but gay organization at SLU, is an all-white space. And my experience with sexuality is inherently different because I'm Black, and the ways in which I come out and choose not to come out relate to race. And in that space, I felt like that experience has been, my experience has been one of isolation, and feeling like no one understands what I'm talking about, and my perspective. And and from the Black community, I think I've, like, I don't know if one can identify as an activist. I do activist work, and Black liberation work specifically, and I have wanted to, like, throw myself into that, but realizing that, like, I haven't been socialized in Black spaces. I don't know what it's like to be Black in America. I don't know what the experience of being stopped on SLU's campus and being asked to see your ID. Like, I don't know what that's like. And so feeling like maybe I don't want this role, but my role is to be a bridge builder between white communities and Black communities specifically. Not that there aren't, like, roles for other people of color, but, like, this is my role in life, my calling. Yeah, and, like, being a bridge is a really alienating experience. My friend Moret talked about this idea of, like, having one foot on the dock and one foot in the boat, and never being totally in either place. This sounds super depressing. I'm not depressed. It's just real.
Yeah, no, this is great. Like, honestly, like, this is, like, what I feel like our teachers try to get at with this class. Just, like, telling, like, real stories and just, like, being, yeah, like, the most, like, trying to, like, evaluate our lives to be, like, the most authentic we can be. Like, using, I mean, I don't know, we can kind of, I guess, talk more about, like, well, labeling purposes. Like, in our class, it's been like a topic of conversation, like how valuable those are, and like kind of language that's used, because in some ways it's like seems like such a necessity to life, like to be able to like put things in categories. But how, like, I mean, obviously, like, we're seeing the impacts of like that currently in situations in the world. But yeah, I guess, like, if you want to talk a little bit about your opinion on that, if you have a strong opinion on that, or whatever.
I think, like, so labels are really important, and they're constricting. And I think for me, like, having language to name my lived experience has made me feel understood in the world in a way that, like, not having labels would not have provided that experience. And labeling things inherently creates divisions, inherently creates an us-them dynamic between not even just the privileged group and the oppressed group, but even within the oppressed group as well. And so I see it as important, and I know that, like, it can be limiting. Like, identifying as gay can be limiting, because, like, how do I negotiate that if I, like, fall in love with a man? I don't expect that to happen, but if that were to happen, how do I negotiate that identity in a world where, like, we force people to pick one thing and stick with it, and when people deviate from the thing that they picked, then they get policed for that. And so I think it's complicated. It's really, really complicated. And I think for me, labeling is empowering. For someone else, like, being fluid and just kind of being is empowering for some. I think it's just one of those things where, like the platinum rule, like, do unto others as they want done onto them. Like, maybe labeling is super empowering for me, but is constricting for another person, and, like, recognizing that as someone's truth, I think, is really important in evaluating labeling and, like, the benefits and problems with it.
So you think, like, because people talk about, like, solutions to this and, like, approaching this, and a lot of things that have come up, even from, like, professors we've interviewed, have been, like, you know, like expanding education and like experiences and like trying to get to know people. Like our teacher emphasizes this all the time, like not following the single story, like trying to like do that. Yeah, she was like had us watch that video.
I love that TED Talk.
Yeah,
so good.
But just like, what does that look like when in your situation where you're talking about like being a bridge builder and you're constantly kind of like coming against these things? Like, how can you implement these things that, like, in theory, everyone should agree with, right? Like, they'd want to treat others the way they want to be treated. Mm-hmm. But what that actually looks like in your experiences.
In my experience, like, negotiating that process looks a lot like meeting people where they are. And sometimes where people are is a really uncomfortable and frustrating place for me. But I think, like, that's where the work is. Yeah, I think the most recent example, which we've talked about endlessly, is the Ignatian Family Teach-In and the group that went, and like feeling like I was the bridge from blackness to whiteness, and like having to be the like racial reconciliation, the mechanism for that, and having to explain to a group of white kids like what racism is and like how that impacts black people, because really I wasn't speaking about my experience, I was speaking about the black experience, which is something we like shy away from doing because like I can't speak for everyone's experience, but in some ways like tokenizing myself helps people to understand what I'm talking about in a way that just like speaking from my experience doesn't.
Does that ever take like a toll on you to kind of have to like do that, like constantly have to like be this voice for something that you're not necessarily like completely comfortable expressing because it's not like your experience? And because I think on like for people like, I don't know, like a lot of the people who went to the teach-in too were wanting to like, I feel like that was the question of the hour, like how can like we then take on this role? And like I have such an issue of like speaking out of like my experience, like not like wanting to do that because I don't know, I admit to like my ignorances on many levels, but it's hard for me to try to then like have a conversation with like my family or something and be like, but this is like how these people live, and like, but you don't know, like you never grew up like this, like what? It's kind of a long-winded question, but how do you kind of manage that, or what do you even?
Yeah, like the burden of education is something I don't get to choose, because like when I'm in spaces where my identity is being invalidated, I don't get to choose whether or not I speak up because my identity is being invalidated, and that not only affects myself but affects everyone else who identifies that way. And yeah, I feel like educating is my vocation, and it's hard feeling like I don't have a choice in the matter, and sometimes I just find myself being overwhelmed with emotions and just feeling walked on. There's this anthology of poems called This Bridge Called My Back, and like feeling that a lot, not only in the context of the teach-in but just in the context of classrooms, and even this racial justice group. It's really hard being like one of the few or like the only person of color in a room and being forced to speak on behalf of all communities of color. that's really hard, and I feel like I don't get to choose whether or not I'm in that situation. Like, when someone says something that's racist, like, I feel like I have to say something, and I haven't learned the ability to turn that off, to, like, pick and choose which battles I want to fight, because they all feel personal. And that doesn't just apply to identities that I fall into, but this idea that, like, our liberations are bound up in one another's, and if a governor is saying that they're not going to let Syrian refugees into a state, like, that offends me, and it should offend everyone. And so I feel like I have to speak.
What do you think, like, other people don't? Like, I know it's hard to, like, speak for that, or just, like, I think it's, like, tied up in the ability to just, like, pass over these, like, things because of privilege, or...
And I think, I actually know this to be true. When people are shaken awake from the comfort of privilege and power and complicity, they can't pretend that didn't happen. And when that moment of awakening happens, that moment turns into a lifelong moment, and people no longer have the choice whether or not to pay attention.
So would you say, like, that moment for you was, like, high school, or is that...
I think so. I think there's always, like, a big moment, and then there are, like, moments along the path that led to the big moment, and moments after the big moment. A lot of the little moments happened in high school, and I would say even the murder of Michael Brown and Occupy SLU and the Ferguson uprisings were moments on the path. I don't think that was the big moment. I went on the civil rights pilgrimage last semester. I think that was a significant moment on the path, but still wasn't the big path. I don't think the big moment happened until this summer. I was at a protest for this young man named Brandon Claxton, who was 18 years old and was walking in North City and was stopped by police officers and shot in the face. And he was hospitalized, and his mother wasn't allowed to come see him, which is illegal. And so there were two actions. One that happened the night of the night that he was shot, and people were tear gassed and thrown against the ground. And I went to the second action the day after, and I came face to face with my privilege. I saw this 15-year-old kid be thrown against the ground, and they were crying, and police officers were hitting them, and I saw a Ferguson activist being dragged on the ground, and I felt fear for the first time, like real, am I going to die today fear. And I think that moment changed my life. And so I wasn't involved in Occupy SLU, and I wasn't really involved in the Ferguson uprisings. But after that protest, I knew I didn't have a choice anymore whether or not to get involved in this work. And that I was obligated. I didn't identify as a Christian at this point, but like now I would say that like I have a Christian obligation to be involved in Black liberation work. And yeah, after that moment, this semester, I've thrown myself into that. And I don't know what I'm doing. I'm like messing it up and trudging through the best I know how. But I feel like I have to, because that moment was so real for me in a way that I'm not sure I will ever experience again.
It's like kind of like transcending like all the other stuff, like your labels or stereotypes or anything like that in that time, just to be called to do that. That's cool.
Yeah. I wasn't, in that moment, after experiencing that, I wasn't able to, I never did this externally, but internally, like, make excuses for people. Like, oh, well, maybe the kid just, like, wasn't being respectful or, like, ended up in the situation because of some fault of their own. Like, I saw what injustice looks like and what, like, violence looks like. State-sanctioned violence looks like against vulnerable people. And I didn't have a choice anymore. I had to do something.
Right. I don't think much more can be said after that. But that is awesome.